I'm Sharon from Site B Fibers. I absolutely love this scarf. I'm going to show you how to make it on your rigid heddle loom. This is the yarn I'm going to use for my weft for the scarf. It's a very nice washable wool that has 219 yards per skein. For the warp, I'm going to use this Mandala Ombre. This is a 100% acrylic yarn, but it's actually very soft and washable. And it has 344 yards per skein. I'm going to show you how to work through this project planning sheet so we can estimate how much yarn we're going to need for the scarf project. In the top, I've written down the name of the project and I've written down the type of yarn I'm going to use for the warp and for the weft. I wrote down from the yarn package how much yarn there is, yards per skein. You can also include things like dye lot or anything else. You don't really need yards per pound for yarn that comes in a skein. You can check the show notes to get a PDF copy of this. I have used various versions and this is the one I've settled on. Okay, so my heddle size. I'm using a 7.5 ends per inch heddle, so that goes in my first slot. First thing I'm going to do is write down the finished width of the project. That's after washing. So I want my project to be 7 inches wide when it's all done. I have to add 10% for shrinkage, take up and shrinkage. 10% of 7 is really 0.7, so I'm just going to round that up to 1. So our total width on the loom is going to be 8 inches wide. The set for our project is the same as the heddle size, 7.5 ends per inch. So we're going to multiply the total width on the loom times the set to get the total number of warp yarns we're going to need in the project. So 7.5 times 8 is 60. We need 60 warp yarns. Now I'm going to put in the finished length. I'm going to make a pretty long scarf this time. I want my finished length after washing to be 72 inches. Again, I have to add 10% for take up and shrinkage. 10% of 72 is 7.2, so I'm just going to round that off to 7. 18 inches for loom waist. Every loom project has loom waist, but we can use that loom waist as our fringe. So if we add all of those numbers together, what we're going to get is 97 inches. Divide that by 36 and we'll convert it to yards. We get 2.7 yards. So I'm going to just round that off to 3 yards. Oops, there goes my dog running into the camera. Okay, so what we know now is that we're going to need a total of 3 yards for our warp length. So if we take that 3 yards and we multiply it by the number of ends that we calculated from before, we can then figure out our yarn requirement for the warp. So we have 3 times 60 is 180. We need 180 yards for our warp to make this scarf. So if we compare that to the Mandala Ombre yardage per skein, which I wrote up above, we're going to have plenty of yarn to make this scarf. Plenty of warp yarn. Okay, now there's a section at the bottom that you can use to calculate your weft requirements. However, for a balanced weave, its rule of thumb is 2/3 the amount of yarn for your warp is equal to your weft. So if I take my yarn calculation of 180 yards for the warp and I multiply that by 2/3, that's going to give me a good estimate of my weft yarn. And that means I need about 120 yards for weft. And in this case, I have 219 in my ball of ultra wool, so I have plenty of yarn to make this scarf from the 2 skeins. I know from my project planning sheet that I want my warp ends to each be 3 yards long. So what I like to do is use a guide string to ensure that my warp is the right length. This is a scrap yarn that I have in my stash, some coned yarn from who knows where. So I'm going to measure out a length 3 yards long using my yardstick. So there's 1, 2, and 3. Now what I like to do is put my guide string, I like to tie it on one side of the loom, put it around the peg, and tie it to the other side. So I'm going to just double it over so that my guide string is actually twice the length of my warp ends. Oh, there it goes, right on the floor. Okay, so this is my guide string. So now I'm ready to use this to set up my warp so that I will get, each warp end will be 3 yards long. Let's go ahead and get this loom set up for warping. I've collected all my tools that I need to warp, and I'm gonna get everything ready to go here. So this is my heddle, it's a 7.5. Got my hook, I've got my peg, got my clamp, I've got 2 rubber bands all ready to go. I'm gonna clamp the loom to the table. So that's the back end of the loom. It's got a little hole there so I can clamp it down. You can also use C-clamps or other clamps to supplement this one if you like. Nice and sturdy. Next thing I'm going to do is put the heddle in the neutral position with my markings facing the back of the loom so I can use them as a guide. Rubber bands from the apron rod to the heddle just to keep the back apron rod in place as I'm measuring out my warp. Here's the guide string that I measured out earlier. I want to measure out a 3-yard warp. My guide string is 6 yards long, twice as long as my warp. I'm going to tie it onto one side of the back apron rod with a nice secure double knot. And then I'm going to take the other end of my guide string and tie it to the other side of the apron rod. Again, in a nice sturdy double knot so it doesn't come loose while I'm working. What I can do is I'm going to stretch my guide string out and put it around the peg. That'll give me 3 yards of warp for each warp thread. I need to adjust the length of the table from the peg so that my guide string is just tight. It doesn't have to be super tight, but that's going to ensure that I get 3 yards for each warp thread. And I want to start measuring 4 inches from the center so that my piece is centered on the loom. I'm going to tie my warp yarn onto the back apron rod 4 inches from the center of the heddle. That's going to allow me to have an 8-inch piece on the loom that's centered in the heddle. Using the larger side of my hook, I'm going to thread the slots. So I'm going to put my hook through the slot, pull the yarn through, take it around the peg, loop the yarn around the back apron rod, and then use the hook to get it into the next slot. Just gotta have to always wrap it around the back apron rod and then pull the yarn around all the way to the peg. We're gonna thread every slot for 8 inches. You don't need to put a lot of tension on your warp yarn at this point, just enough to keep it taut, but you don't want a lot of tension because that will cause your peg to fall off the shelf. And that makes people very sad. We don't want sad weavers. So I'm just gonna work my way all the way across the heddle until I have 8 inches total. I am so happy with the way these stripes are turning out with this variegated yarn in the warp. It is so beautiful. Now that I've reached the end of the 8 inches on the loom, it's time to cut the yarn and tie it off to the back apron rod. So I'm just going to snip it off, tie it with a nice sturdy double knot so that it stays in place under tension on the loom. And now I am done measuring out my warp. Let's take off the rubber bands and cut off the guide string. We don't want to wind the guide string up with our warp. It won't hurt anything, but it doesn't need to be there. You're going to walk over to your peg, just pull the yarn off the peg and lie it down on the floor in a nice neat pile. We're going to get our papers ready and we're going to wind the yarn onto the back beam. So I engage the clamp for the back beam, the ratchet for the back beam, and here comes my first paper. This is the most awkward part, just getting that first piece of paper started while you're winding your warp. So you kind of stick it in there, pull the warp back. I like to just wind it by hand to get things going. And just kind of work it out until that first paper gets completely worked into your warp. Once I get to the end of the paper, I'm going to go around to the other side of the loom and give the warp a nice firm tug. That's going to pull out all the extra slack out of my warp as I'm winding, which helps when you put your yarn under tension. I'm going to put my second paper in. I'm just going to wind it up. I like to hold the paper in the middle while I'm winding it after I get the first one going. Now I'm going to go back around, grab up all my warp, and give it a nice firm tug. This is why we keep the loom clamped to the table during our winding. My papers are short. I only have about a half a yard for each paper. And the reason why is because that way I always remember to stop and give my warp a nice tug. All right, there goes another one. Walk around the loom. I'm going to give it a tug, pull out the slack. Whoops. I pulled too hard. I pulled it right off the table. Oh well, it's a small loom. I'm probably going to just forget the clamp for now and just hold it with my hand while I'm tugging on it to get rid of that extra slack. You can wind it up a little before you insert your next paper, because when you pull on it, the paper pulls out a bit. This yarn is winding like a dream. Having no issues, no tangles, everything's just going so smoothly. I love it when that happens. I really like to show weavers how to warp their looms by themselves, because you don't want to have to wait around for somebody to show up to help you wind your warp. And also, this is a way to do it without having to buy any other equipment. There's lots of different tools you can use to help you with this process, but I like to teach everyone how to do it without any extra tools so you can do it all on your own. Now, when you get to the end of your warp, just be very careful not to pull the loops through your heddle. That's so sad. I've done it. I've made every mistake possible. And then you have to rethread the heddle, and it's just a big pain. We're all done winding the warp onto the loom. Now it's time to thread the heddle. First thing I'm going to do is just cut off all the loops at the end. I'm going to intentionally remove one slot yarn from the slot, and then I'm going to make a loop and thread it around the hook to pull it through the hole. So I've got my next slot. I'm going to take a thread out of the slot. I really like to take it all the way out of the slot. Now I'm going to put my hook through the hole and make a loop out of my yarn and pull it through the hole. On next slot. Okay, I've got 2 yarns there. I'm going to take one out. There goes my hook in the hole. I make a loop around the hook and pull it through. If you use this technique for threading your heddle, I think it helps to prevent splitting the yarn as you thread. Sometimes your hook will get in between the plies of your thread and you'll split the yarn in half, and that can be very frustrating. So if you take the time to pull the yarn all the way out of the slot and then thread it through the hole, it may be a little bit easier for you to get the yarn through the hole without splitting the plies. You want to just take a minute to check it as you go to make sure that all of your threading looks good before you get too far into it. This project is pretty small, and it's set at 7.5 ends per inch. So in reality, it only took me about 15 minutes to do all the threading for this scarf. Tying the warp onto the loom is a very important step, so you want to take your time with it. First thing I'm going to do is clamp my loom back down to the table so that I can get a little tension on my threads as I'm tying. I like to also secure the front apron rod with rubber bands, but I have to always remember to put the heddle in the back so it doesn't just flop forward. So I move my heddle to the back slot, and I'm going to just take my 2 rubber bands and secure the front apron rod to the heddle, and that way it'll give me some stability while I'm trying to tie my warp onto the apron rod. I like to start in the middle of my warp, so I'm going to get about 1 inch, and I'm going to divide that inch of warp into 2 parts, wrap it around the front apron rod, and then make 1/2 of a square knot. Okay, and we're going to straighten it out so that the warp goes straight from the back beam through the heddle and to the front apron rod. So I split it in half, wrap it around the front apron rod, and do 1/2 a square knot. Straighten everything out and keep working my way from the center out. Now we're only doing half of the knot, the square knot right now, because we're going to tighten up all the threads so that they have the same tension before we secure them to the apron rod. This is a pretty important step because it's your last chance to get your tension nice and even before you secure your warp to the loom. Don't worry too much if your last bits are a little too big. You can always split them if you need to, or you can add a few extra threads into the last group. All right, now it's time to tighten the tension. I'm going to start on one side and go all the way across, and I'm going to tighten up each one of the knots I just made so that all the yarn has the same tension. It doesn't have to be super tight at this point, but it just needs to be even all the way across your piece. Then you're going to feel it on the front, feel it again on the back. If any of the knots feel loose, you can just tighten them up again. And once everybody has the same tension, you can go ahead and do the second half of your square knot all the way across. After my warp is spaced out, then I wound my stick shuttle with the white weft yarn, and I just started weaving, and I did the whole scarf with the white yarn. The weft for this project is all the same color. I'm using this really nice white color for the weft throughout the entire scarf. So when I reach the end of my stick shuttle, I'm gonna just refill it with that same white yarn. What I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna wrap it around the stick shuttle and fill it up as much as I can so that I can get pretty far on my scarf before I have to refill it again. When I come to the end of the yarn on the shuttle, I'm going to work that last little bit in and just leave a tail in the center of the piece so that I can cut it off later. Then I'm going to pack it down with my heddle, and I'm going to go right back in the down shed, same shed I was in, and I'm going to start my new yarn. And the trick here is to leave an overlap. So here I have about a 2-inch overlap from the yarn that ended and the yarn that's starting. And that's how I'm going to join my new yarn. Now I'm all ready to go so I can keep weaving with the yarn in my new shuttle. Sometimes I just like to put my rigid heddle loom right in my lap and weave while I'm sitting in my chair. Today I'm watching the Tour de France and enjoying the bicycle race while at the same time making this beautiful scarf. And now it's time to cut the piece off the loom. First thing I'm going to do is work in my tail. So I'm going to put it back in the same shed I ended in and just work my tail in. I'm going to secure my edge with some toilet paper. So I'm going to put 3 passes of toilet paper in there, and that's going to just keep everything in place when I cut it off the loom. Okay, so now I have my 3 passes of toilet paper. I'm going to loosen off the tension. You never want to cut your piece off under tension. I'm going to cut it from the back so that I have plenty of room for fringe. There it goes. And I'm going to pull it through my heddle, and now the magic happens. You can release the front brake and just pull it right out, and we'll see that beautiful piece come right off the loom. Oh my goodness, it came out so nice. Oh, look at the colors. Oh, that variegated yarn just gave the most beautiful stripes. I'm so happy with it. Now that the piece is off the loom, the next thing we need to do is secure the ends. In order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully pull out the toilet paper, and then I'm going to tie some overhand knots. So I'm separating out my warp threads in groups of 4 threads, and then I'm just going to make an overhand knot with those 4 threads. So I make a loop and then pull the yarn through the loop and tighten it down right by the edge of the fabric. Okay, so here's my next set of 4. I'm just going to straighten them out, make a loop, pull the yarn through the loop and tighten it down. The trick is to get it tighten the knot right up along the edge of the fabric. I'm going to work my way across here using groups of 4 threads, making overhand knots as I go across. The rest of the process for the first side of the scarf, making overhand knots all the way across. I flipped my scarf over to the other side, took the toilet paper out, and made overhand knots all the way across the second side of the scarf. I've got all my overhand knots done on both sides of the scarf. I'm gonna lay my scarf out, put the 2 edges together, and straighten up all the fringe threads. I can use my fingers first and then fine tune it with a comb. And I'm gonna cut the threads so that they're all the same length. Now, for this job, I like to use my rotary cutter. If you don't have a rotary cutter, you can still put a ruler down and just use a pair of scissors and just cut right along the straight edge. The goal here is to get the fringe equal on both sides of the scarf. I think these fringe are about 6 inches long. I like to check it after I've cut it to make sure that there aren't any stray threads that didn't get cut, that ended up getting twisted up in there. Now here's this trick that I'm going to do is I'm going to put a very heavy book on my scarf, my chemistry textbook, and I'm going to twist my fringe. So I'm going to take each group of 4 and split it in 2, and I'm going to twist it in the same direction. So I'm going to twist the first set of 2 until it twists back on itself, and then I'll twist the second set of 2 until it twists back on itself, and then hold the 2 pieces together, make an overhand knot, and it's like magic. It just twists up into a beautiful little cord. On to the next set. Divide it in 2. I'm twisting it clockwise until it will twist back up on itself. Tricky part is to hold that one aside and twist the other set of 2 clockwise. So you're going to have to hold it in one hand and twist with the other one. And you want to twist it up until the second set will twist up on itself. Secure the end with an overhand knot. And then just kind of let it straighten itself out and it'll twist on itself. So I divide the group in 2. I'm twisting it in the clockwise direction. Now I'm going to twist the second one in the clockwise direction. Both times I'm twisting it until it has enough twist to kind of fold back on itself. Yep, and secure the end with an overhand knot. And then when you let it go, it twists up on itself. Now, I've done it for years by hand, but I also at some point got this cute little fringe twister tool. It does the same thing. You just divide it in half, put half in one clip and half in the other, and you can twist both edges at the same time, which is super handy. And then, yep, twist it back on itself, make sure you have enough twist, and then tie it with an overhand knot. Now, depending on your weaving personality, you can count the number of times you twist it with the fringe twister so that you get the same amount of twist. So I find myself counting to 15 when I do fringe. Again, it's up to you and your weaving personality, how much you twist it, and if you count for everyone. Here you can see me work all the way across the twisted fringe on both sides of the scarf. Finishing is a very important part of weaving. I'm going to finish my piece by washing it in the sink and hand washing it. Even though my yarns are both machine washable, I've decided to hand wash this time because I want to maintain a scarf that has really nice, light, airy hand. So I'm going to try to minimize the amount of shrinkage that happens. Every weaving piece needs to be finished with wet washing so that you can fluff up the fibers. The weaving process traps all the fibers in place, and so this gives the yarn a chance to bloom. Here I'm just gonna keep rinsing it until I get all the soap out, and I'm gonna give it a nice gentle squeeze. To get the excess water out, I'm gonna lay my scarf onto a beach towel, and then I'm gonna fold the towel over it, and then put the rest of the scarf on the towel, the folded towel, and just make it all into a nice little towel scarf burrito. Roll it right up, and this is gonna be a really effective way of getting the excess water out of it. And here's the trick. I'm gonna drop my scarf and towel burrito on the floor and just stand on it and get all that water to absorb into the towel. Look at that. It's soaking wet all the way through the towel. And that does a really great job of getting the excess water out of the piece. I'm gonna spread my washed scarf in the sun. I'm just gonna spread it out flat to dry. And then it will be all done. Here it is, the finished piece. I love this scarf. I made it a little bit long. It wraps around nicely. I love the subtle striping that we get from this variegated yarn in the warp. And I really think this is a very fun and easy project to do on your rigid heddle loom. I hope you have as much fun making it as I did. Please subscribe to my channel and join me for some more projects.